president, chairwoman, businesswoman, on-screen personality, on-screen authority figure, going through a table. Ladies, gentlemen, my non-binary friends, it is I, Josh Robinson here for Love Wrestling, and today we're gonna cross the line, because it's the legacy of Dixie Carter with a special look at TNA Wrestling. In 2002, a booking agency contacted Dixie Carter and informed her that Total Nonstop Action Wrestling, a professional wrestling promotion, required a marketing and publicity outlet. Carter began working with TNA, but 2 months later was informed by Jeff Jarrett, a part owner of TNA, that a key financial backer was having financial problems and due to it was being investigated for accounting irregularities. I know, it's a bit of a word salad there. It had, of course, withdrawn support from TNA, and the company was left in dire straits as a result. Dixie Carter claiming to kind of see the potential in a marketplace that only had one professional wrestling company, WWE, with a US $900 million market cap and no competitor, contacted her parents, the owners of Panda Energy International, a Dallas-based energy company. And of course, in October of 2002, Panda Energy purchased 71% of TNA from the corporation for $250,000. On October 31st, 2002, TNA, which originally traded as J Sports and Entertainment, was renamed TNA Entertainment. Carter was appointed president of TNA Entertainment in spring 2003. So let's set the table here. In 2002, of course, the wrestling industry was going through quite the change. WCW, ECW, WWE's main competitors, were no longer in existence, and WWE was creating competition from within with the brand split. WWE was the only real marketable wrestling organization, entertainment company, whatever you want to call them, in the atmosphere of the world. There wasn't really too much other in a mainstream sense, like directly head-to-head competition with WWE. TNA ought to kind of change that landscape and say, hey, there's still a lot of people from WCW or no longer with WWE that need a platform to kind of present themselves as professional wrestlers. And I guess in the world, especially in the early 2000s, it's not like there was a lot of women in leadership. Dixie Carter was doing something that no other woman had really done before, and that was be a president or chairwoman, whatever you want to call her, CEO, majority shareholder of a wrestling company. Now, a lot of people can and a lot of people have, criticized Dixie Carter of not really knowing the wrestling industry and trying to run a wrestling company. It's not the same kind of thing. Now, in 2002, TNA would kind of start as like a weekly pay-per-view kind of deal where they were just having weekly pay-per-views every single week and doing different things and introducing a lot of new talent along with a lot of talent that have come over from WCW or have whatever, really. There was just a lot of stuff happening in there was a lot of stuff happening in the wrestling industry that wasn't directly related to WWE. TNA was kind of the first American company to kind of be like, hey, we're over here, we're doing our little thing. Now, of course, in 2002, 2003, 2004, there was a lot of a talent that kind of appeared for TNA that you wouldn't even really have realized and went on to WWE or were coming from WWE or from WCW that have just never gone to WWE in that time. Of course, kind of the main people that come to mind when you think of TNA is Jeff Jarrett, Sting, Jeff Hardy, CM Punk, AJ Styles, Samoa Joe. There were so many people that we now know as kind of legends of this business, and at the time some of them were legends or on their way to being legends of the business, but there was a lot of people in TNA that we were getting the opportunity to see on somewhat of a bigger stage than just wrestling on the independents. TNA was kind of making its name for itself, and Dixie Carter was at the helm being the majority shareholder, chairwoman, president, again, whatever you want to kind of refer to it is the time. In the early 2000s or early to mid 2000s, TNA was making its name for what it was. Of course, it was starting to distinguish itself coming into the Impact years and going on to be on Spike TV, a home of WWE for so long for Monday Night Raw on Spike TV. Of course, when WWE moved back to the USA Network in mid 2005, TNA was able to kind of fill the wrestling void that was on Spike TV and was the home of Impact for so many years. Dixie Carter was able to negotiate a deal with Viacom, the kind of owner of Spike TV, and get TNA onto Spike TV in 2005. One of the things that TNA did best to kind of distinguish itself from WWE was, of course, for the most part, I think wrestling fans look at it as a very fun time in TNA, but the 6-sided ring. TNA was able to kind of make itself different by, instead of having a 4-sided ring, of course, had a 6-sided ring. Some wrestlers hate it, some wrestlers love it, some fans hate it, some fans love it, but it was different, it was unique. It was one of the things that maybe Dixie Carter didn't directly think of the idea, but was able to do with Dixie Carter and the TNA wrestling product, was try to make it different. Now, a lot of the times in TNA is often criticized for being kind of WWE 2.0, WWE light, if you feel. A lot of the things that were happening, a lot of the talent that were appearing were a lot of just, hey, they were in WWE or they're WWE affiliated, put them on our show. We're starting to get people like Kurt Angle come along when he had his kind of, falling out with WWE, Christian Cage. I mentioned Jeff Hardy before. You still had TNA originals like AJ Styles and Samoa Joe and Christopher Daniels and Kazarian, people like that, able to do kind of, to again mesh with the kind of WWE, whatever you want to call them, the WWE alumni coming over to the shows in TNA. Of course, one of the mainstays of TNA's time, and one of the mainstays of the Dixie Carter regime in TNA, was of course the icon Sting. Sting, up until that point, never appeared in WWE and was kind of moving on from WCW and became like a legend of TNA kind of instantly. He was working with all different kinds of stars throughout and actively wrestling all the time, doing different versions of the Sting gimmick, the Joker Sting and everything like that in TNA, and became kind of like a face of TNA and a guy that had never gone to WWE again up until he did, after the kind of TNA stuff kind of come to an end, which we're going to get on in a minute. But Dixie Carter was able to negotiate with a lot of these talents, and she brought in people that would kind of help her along the way. Vince Russo famously worked for TNA in its early years, Bruce Pritchard, Eric Bischoff, Hulk Hogan. People like this were able to come into TNA and I guess help Dixie Carter. Dixie Carter didn't come from a wrestling background. I think that's a biggest criticism of Dixie Carter and kind of shaping up TNA, is that, who is this woman? Where did she kind of come from? Why should we trust her with a wrestling product? Now, there's some people in the wrestling atmosphere, and probably listening to this show right now, that have never watched TNA. And that's fine. I think it's always, you should do your due diligence as a wrestling fan to kind of go back and see why wrestling is where it is today. Now, I know a lot of people are going to probably take this the wrong way, but a lot of the product that we see with WWE and AEW right now is there's shavings of what TNA had in their product to kind of bring it into the forefront today. TNA is a big part of wrestling history. Of course, it's now kind of in a different state with Impact Wrestling, and I guess it's kind of a byproduct of TNA. Although it is the same company, it doesn't have the same feel as when Dixie Carter was in the helm throughout 2002 to 2016. There was a lot of things different. TNA went through a lot of ebbs and flows. Of course, kind of mainly the Impact Zone was a big topic of discussion that a lot of wrestling people had. Dixie Carter has stated in many interviews, there's been many interviews with other people surrounding her, like the Eric Bischoffs of the world, like the Vince Russos of the world, that have said, we need to get out of the Impact Zone. Now, Dixie Carter said from a cost perspective, it was just much easier to stay in Orlando, stay at Universal, and stay in the Impact Zone. Now, I think there's two sides of the coin. A lot of people can look at that like, oh, we want to see TNA, we want to see it different on television, we want different crowds to see how these talent are getting over in different markets of the United States and the world. But a lot of people can say the Impact Zone was one of the key components of TNA, especially in the kind of mid to late 2000s, is that that was TNA. It was in the Impact Zone. It kind of was a part of the show, as kind of other companies have had previously, with NXT kind of being like Full Sail was its home for so long, and that's what made NXT. Impact could have the easy argument of saying, hey, this is what makes TNA Impact, is that it's in the Impact Zone every single week. Dixie Carter was a big proponent of keeping TNA and Impact inside the Impact Zone, and a lot of people have often criticized her for such. Now, a lot of people are often quick to judge TNA and the kind of stuff that was going on. There was a lot of wacky stuff that was happening on the show. There was a lot of wacky decisions that Dixie Carter was making behind the scenes. However, one thing that we can say about TNA is that they had no lack of talent. TNA was able to hire, and Dixie Carter was able to hire some of the biggest names in professional wrestling, whether you agree with them or not. Of course, I mentioned Sting, I mentioned Jeff Hardy, Christian Cage, Kurt Angle, Ric Flair, Mick Foley, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, Hulk Hogan, Eric Bischoff. These are just some of the names that TNA had in their roster at some point or another. They had mega names. It is interesting to see what TNA could have been, and so many times we've seen Dixie Carter have press conferences and say, hey, a huge thing is happening in TNA. I know it sounds very familiar with something else with announcements and stuff, but I digress. Dixie Carter was often saying this is going to change the landscape of TNA. This is going to change the landscape of TNA Impact on Thursday nights or Wednesday nights or sometimes Friday nights. They had many different nights that they were on during their tenure, but often she would say, we're going to change the landscape of TNA. We're going to change the landscape of the industry, and it would be something like a Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff. They briefly moved to Monday nights in 2010 to go directly head-to-head with Raw. It lasted 2 months. It's not to say that as the president or chairwoman of TNA that Dixie Carter didn't at least take chances. Again, the criticism comes with, does she really know? Did she really know what she was doing in the landscape of things? Were there too many people in her ear maybe telling her, do this, don't do this? And because not coming from a wrestling background, it is kind of interesting to say the least of like, ooh, what are you really doing here, Dixie? What is TNA going to become in 10, 20, 30 years? Now, why TNA had its businesswoman, its chairwoman in Dixie Carter, it's not to say that Dixie Carter didn't appear on TNA television. Now, it is kind of sporadic appearances, I guess you could say, throughout 2009 to 2012. We knew who Dixie Carter was. She'll kind of make her very first appearance on TNA Impact on the 27th of August 2009. She was interviewing new signee Bobby Lashley. Now, of course, in early 2010, after the debuts of Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff, Carter became somewhat of a regular authority figure on Impact. She would kind of lose her on-screen power to Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff, who were kind of evil, the standard heel authority figure stuff. Now, there was like a whole court battle on TV between Hogan, Bischoff, and Dixie Carter, and then kind of would kind of be on and off TV again. She would eventually come back to TNA in 2013, and she would kind of reveal Dixieland. There was a whole thing throughout 2013 to 2014 where Dixie Carter put her hands and dipped her toes into being that evil heel authority figure. I think a lot of people credit her willingness, I guess you could say. Some people couldn't stand the fact that Dixie Carter was on television with not a lot of experience, or any experience on TV beforehand, or especially in a wrestling sense. I, for one, am a big fan of Dixie Carter and Dixieland and all that stuff happening with AJ Styles, and she was just being the typical heel authority figure. She would get involved with the Aces and Eights stuff, she would get involved with all different kinds of stuff at Impact, and eventually kind of get into a little bit of a program with Bully Ray. And I think everyone knows that when they're in the Hammerstein Ballroom in 2014, I believe it was, June 27th, 2014, at the taping, she was finally put through a table, taking her, I think, first and only bump in wrestling. I could honestly be wrong about that. Someone fact check me in the comments, I'm sure, but I think that's her one and only bump in wrestling, was going through that table by Bully Ray in 2014. Now, a lot of stuff happened throughout the mid-2010s with TNA and Dixie Carter in particular. She would agree to be the chairwoman of TNA in 2016, and having Billy Corgan take over the presidency soon after it was announced that Corgan would sue the company and Carter after he was lied to about how he would get his money back. On November 30, it was reported that Carter and Corgan had settled the lawsuit against TNA, with Atham Sports and Entertainment Corporation acquiring the loans and Corgan made to Carter in the process. In late 2016, it was reported that once Corgan's lawsuit was settled, TNA would go through a restructuring period that would see ownership change. This was when Dixie Carter would kind of be on her way out of TNA. She would only retain 5% majority shares in TNA, leaving her with no decision-making power in Total Nonstop Action going forward. It announced that Anthem had purchased the 85% majority of TNA Wrestling. Carter resigned as chairwoman after 14 years in charge, and Ed Northam took over as president of TNA, eventually renaming it Impact Wrestling. TNA would not be seen again. It's kind of had its history with Impact Wrestling now, but Dixie Carter was no bit worth to be seen. She had a little appearance last year as a part of a Hall of Fame thing, but Dixie Carter and wrestling is just non-existent now. Dixie Carter is just doing her thing after a very long time in professional wrestling, and one that probably kind of gets a little bit maybe overlooked, or maybe that's not the word to use. Maybe it's a little bit like, we look at her as very not exactly knowing completely what she was doing in the role, but we don't really know what goes on behind closed doors. But I do want to kind of leave you on this before we wrap up with this one, is that there has been a lot of people throughout the years that have criticized Dixie Carter about TNA. AJ Styles, who was kind of dubbed as the face of TNA, said that Carter ruined TNA because of her not knowing what's best for business. We've had people like Tara, Victoria, Lisa Marie Varon, say that she ended in bad terms with TNA, stating that she wanted to, quote-unquote, punch her in the face. Former TNA creative writer Vince Russo has also been critical of Carter's management style at TNA, stating, Dixie just did so much more damage than good, just not being upfront honest and not being kind of upfront with everything that was underhanded and going behind people's back. And just kind of not having a real grasp on what the wrestling industry is. Former TNA executive producer Eric Bischoff has both praised and been critical of Carter, stating Dixie is, number one, a very intelligent woman. She is incredibly savvy in terms of her ability to sell and get to buy in. I'm talking about people at very high executive levels. She gained a lot of confidence with people at Viacom. You don't know that if you're an idiot. You don't know that if you have zero talent. So she's a very accomplished woman and a very intelligent woman. Whereas with Dixie, I don't think that she had a vision when she started. I really don't think that she had a vision of where she wanted to be or how she wanted to get there. Even when TNA had been on Spike for a while, there was never a clear picture of the destination. It seems as if Dixie Carter is a very intelligent businesswoman, but not a very intelligent wrestling person. There's a very big difference. Other people have criticized Dixie Carter over the time, including Velvet Sky, Angelina Love, Booker T, Shelly Martinez. Kurt Angle has always been very, very praising of Dixie Carter throughout his time, stating, I thought she was a great boss. I never had any problem with her, and she did a great thing for TNA in its time. All in all, I think it's very safe to say that TNA wrestling has a very special place in a lot of wrestling fans' heart in a time where there was nothing else to watch in professional wrestling but WWE. It was the clear juggernaut of the business throughout all of the 2000s into the 2010s. TNA had its place, and TNA holds a very high regard in so many wrestling fans' minds. That's going to do it for this episode and this season of The Legacy of. Season 4 has come to an absolute end. We are going on hiatus with this show for a little while. You will not see any of The Legacy of probably until the end of the year here on Love Wrestling. Now, does that mean that you won't hear anything from me on Love Wrestling until the end of the year? Time will tell. You'll see about some stuff that I potentially have in the works here on Love Wrestling. But please, tell me what you love about Dixie Carter, TNA Wrestling, and this season of The Legacy of, all in the comments below. Leave a like, share, subscribe, all that kind of good stuff. Make sure you follow Love Wrestling pretty much across the board at Love Wrestling CA. You can follow me everywhere pretty much at JoshRobinson_00. And yeah, thanks for all the love and support on this season of The Legacy of, and all 4 seasons of The Legacy of here exclusively on Love Wrestling. Until next time, folks, my name is Josh Robinson. I'm signing off. Peace out, everyone.